Welcome to our explainer. If you live in a major city, you just kind of expect your local government to track and share basic safety data, right? Well, today we're unraveling a real civic mystery centered around one specific troubled address in Toronto, where that expectation literally hit a brick wall. We're going to look at this fascinating collision between a community in crisis, the bureaucratic systems meant to manage it, and one resident's fight for the simple truth.
Let's dive right into this powerful demand letter from a resident named Paul Vandermark. He's urgently seeking answers about what's actually happening in his building over at 251 Sherbourne Street. And he's not messing around here. He formally requested a coordinated data disclosure. He doesn't want opinions or vague reassurances. He's asking for hard, undeniable numbers on the emergency responses and enforcement actions happening literally right outside his front door.
But here's the wild part. What Paul is dealing with is essentially a blank slate. We're talking about a completely empty data sheet, an absolute void of information when it comes to emergency responses and safety enforcement at his home. In any modern city, you'd assume this kind of data is just readily available, right? Actively used to manage public safety. But for the residents here, it's a total blackout.
So to fill that void, Paul isn't just knocking on one door. He's demanding a coordinated breakdown of incident frequency and resource use across three major municipal agencies: Toronto Fire Services, the Toronto Police Service, and the Toronto Community Housing Corporation. He wants the real numbers. How many fire service responses are actually just false alarms? What's the total number of police calls broken down by incident type? And what are the Housing Corporation's staffing patterns and enforcement actions looking like? He gets that to truly understand the reality of his building, you have to look at the whole cross-agency picture. Part 1. Inside the Dan Harrison Community Complex, or DHCC. To really get why Paul is demanding this specific data, we need to zoom out and look at the actual environment of 251 Sherbourne. It's part of a much larger property known as the Dan Harrison Community Complex, and the architectural contrast here is pretty striking. You've got 15 historic three-story Victorian buildings right on Sherbourne Street. Then, nestled right between and behind them are two 1970s mid-rise apartments. So you have these totally different eras of architecture sharing a single internal courtyard. And because there's a free flow of access, multiple informal entry points, and fire exits backing out onto an alleyway, it creates some incredibly unique safety challenges. Across all those diverse buildings, there are 376 total units. But here is the truly staggering part. Out of those 376 units, 374 of them are rent geared to income. There are literally only 2 market units in the entire complex. So right off the bat, that tells us this property serves a highly vulnerable population, many of whom are experiencing deep, deep poverty. And make no mistake, the city is well aware of the conditions. The official draft business case for the complex pulls absolutely no punches. It explicitly describes the physical and social conditions of the property as a, quote, crisis-level situation for tenants. It points out that the surrounding area is home to vulnerable folks dealing with addiction, mental health challenges, violence, and homelessness. And this complex, well, it's essentially acting as a microcosm of all those broader neighborhood issues. Part 2. Demographics of a crisis. Let's look at who actually lives at the DHCC. To wrap our heads around the unique safety challenges here, we really have to understand the people. The demographic data from that business case reveals a pretty heavy skew in the population. Males make up 66% of the tenants, which means they outnumber female tenants 2 to 1. The age distribution is super interesting too. While there are some families with children, mostly residing in those Victorian homes, over half the residents, about 56%, are working-age adults. Seniors make up another significantly large chunk at 31%. Overall, the average age across the entire complex sits right around 48 years old. But here is the absolutely crucial point to take away from this. A massive 87% of these households are individuals living completely alone. That's 301 single-person households out of 345 total. When you're assessing community vulnerability and safety, that level of isolation is a massive, massive factor. Now, when you combine a highly isolated population with the physical vulnerabilities of the property, things get incredibly tense. A safety audit from back in December 2018 flagged some major physical flaws. We're talking outdated intercoms, burnt-out lights, high-traffic foyers, poor sightlines, and all these hidden corners.
When a site has that many blind spots and informal entry points, the risk for antisocial activity just skyrockets. It basically creates an environment that's incredibly difficult to keep secure.
Part 3. The Law of Trespassing. Let's look at the legal defense tools available. So this tricky physical layout brings us right back to Paul's main data request. How often are trespassing charges actually being laid to secure this property? To get how this works, we have to look at the Ontario Trespass to Property Act. Under this act, an occupier has the legal power to control who is allowed on the premises. An occupier doesn't just mean the owner. It actually includes housing authority staff and security personnel, basically anyone who has responsibility and control over the condition of the place and the activities going on there.
But they can't just go arresting anyone on site. To strictly enforce those trespassing laws, proper legal notice has to be given first. The law outlines 3 very distinct ways to do this. The occupier can give notice orally or in writing, they can post clearly visible signs, or they can use a very specific color-coded marking system.
This part is actually pretty fascinating. The law allows for something as simple as a 10-centimeter painted circle to act as full legal notice. No joke, a painted red circle legally means entry is completely prohibited. A yellow circle means entry is prohibited except for certain permitted activities. As long as those little painted circles are placed at normal points of access, they carry the exact same weight as a giant written sign. And the stakes for ignoring those notices, they are incredibly high. Violating the Trespass to Property Act is a serious offense. It can hit you with heavy fines of up to $10,000. Plus, it actually empowers a police officer or even the occupier themselves to arrest the trespasser right then and there without a warrant. It is a really powerful tool, and that is exactly why Paul wants to know if and how it's actually being used at his building. Part 4, Seeking Coordinated Solutions. Let's look at the systemic response. Okay, so let's recap. We have a complex in a designated crisis, a highly vulnerable and isolated population, and strict laws right there on the books ready to enforce safety. So how is the complex actually using these tools? Well, in response to the rising crime and antisocial activity, they kicked off nearly $1 million in upgrades back in 2019. They spent $900,000 installing better lighting, brand new cameras, and key card access, while also retrofitting the front lobby. On top of that, the Housing Corporation deployed special constables for 24/7 security coverage. When you map Paul's specific data request against the reality of the complex's business case, the whole picture really starts to come into focus. On one hand, you have a resident just trying to get the real numbers, the police calls, the trespassing charges, the actual security deployment. On the other hand, you've got the systemic reality, acknowledged increases in crime year over year, powerful trespassing laws available to use, and massive financial investments in physical security. Paul is just trying to connect the dots. He wants to see if that expensive reality is actually making a dent in the raw data. But we always come right back to that blank data sheet. That empty void represents the critical missing link between these grand bureaucratic business plans and the actual daily safety of the residents. Without that data, residents like Paul have absolutely no way of knowing if those $900,000 security upgrades are actually working. They don't know if the trespassing laws are being enforced or if emergency services are being deployed effectively. They are completely left in the dark. Which leaves us with one absolutely crucial final thought. Can a struggling community ever truly be revitalized without first sharing the real numbers with the people who live there every single day? I mean, if a city acknowledges a crisis and spends nearly $1 million to fix it, don't the residents have a fundamental right to the data that proves whether or not they are actually safe? It's a massive question that goes way beyond 251 Sherbourne Street, and it's one that every city is going to have to eventually answer. Thanks for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.